Good evening, everyone, and welcome here to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. My co-chair, Greg Boyko, and I would like to thank all of you for sharing your evening with us and helping making this a special night. I'd like to thank Stanley Black & Decker for their corporate sponsorship, as well as Tom Lips and Greg Boyko for their sponsorship, and all of our sponsors. This program would not be possible as it is without the help of sponsors. I would also like to thank Megan Story and her staff, wonderful staff, our board members, the committee members, our members at large, as well as all of you for being here tonight. I also like to thank Goodwin University for opening up their campus for us this evening. The World Affairs Council has been bringing the world to Connecticut for a century. And I believe their events and programs have provided us with the opportunity to better understand and broaden our understanding of the world, the people of the world, and places, and ourselves in the world. So I hope tonight that you would benefit or experience some of that from our special featured guest, Director William Barnes, and our special moderator, the CBS News evening anchor, Norah O'Donnell. So with that, thank you for being here, and Greg Boyko has a few words to say.
Thank you, Chuck, and good evening, and welcome everyone. And for our Japanese friends, minasama konbanwa. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here this evening and for supporting this wonderful organization as it starts its second century. Winston Churchill is reported to have said, "Americans always do the right thing after they've exhausted all the other possibilities." But without question, Sir Winston was not talking about the people of Connecticut or the members and the supporters of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. We live in a magnificent world. Technology and medical breakthroughs have given us stunning advances in quality of life and health. Yet these same technologies, unfortunately, have created a world where it's all too easy not to get to a common experience. Social media and other technologies make it too easy for us to stay on our side of the fence and not look on the other side of the fence. But the World Affairs Council of Connecticut does just that. It looks on both sides of the fence, here and the rest of the world, and it exposes our citizens to all of the points of view and brings the big, beautiful, and diverse world here to Connecticut. If we look back 100 years to 1924, we can see why the council was formed. A group of forward-thinking people in the Hartford area, many of them at Trinity, as well as in the rest of the nation, realized that after the Great War, the First World War, isolationism was not the answer. I'm sure they saw that by educating our citizenry about the rest of the world and creating interactions and understanding, we could avoid further conflict. Yet, obviously, we've had other conflicts, so the work of the council is not done, and we need to work more than ever to open the minds of our people and bring the world to Connecticut. Now, tonight it's my honor to talk about some of the leaders that we've had at the World Affairs Council over the many years. Through the past century, the dedication of the Council's leaders has created an organization that continues to build in strength and vitality. Thank you to all the Council's leaders, past and present, who embody the Council's mission to foster a globally informed and engaged community. The commitment of these individuals has created an enduring impact on the Council and the world in which we live. I will now like to read the names of our honored Council presidents who are here with us tonight, so if they would please come up on the stage. So with us tonight we have Alex Coral, Leslie Robertson, Scott Wilson, myself, Sim Sohn, and hold the applause, and Daniel Weiner, and our current president, Mr. Arthur House. So So this is a tremendous assembly of leaders, and I want to thank all of them and all of the leaders of the past who have made this organization as great as it is. Now I have the distinct honor to highlight two extraordinary leaders in council history, and I'll ask you to hold your applause until I've introduced them both. The first is Paul Buddy Buca, and unfortunately he could not be with us tonight, but I think most, if not all of you, know him. Paul is revered across the nation for his courage and selflessness that he revealed during one of the most difficult times a person could experience when he served in Vietnam. His actions earned him the Congressional Medal of Honor. Even more, he is revered within the council community for who he is as a leader, colleague, and friend, and we are fortunate to have worked with him over the years. Paul's very presence inspires. At every opportunity, he displays his character, his commitment to uplifting others, his advocacy for fellow veterans, his humor, and his dedication to creating a more peaceful and informed world. We're deeply fortunate not only for Paul's expertise and leadership, but his presence and his example. The second person is someone I suspect many of you know personally, and he may even be the reason you were brought into the council community and are here in this room tonight. It's Peter G. Kelly. He is not just a giant of our community, he is a champion of global democracy, a philanthropist with a generosity of spirit to match. Peter has dedicated much of his life's work to the betterment of his community, his world, and this organization, the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, that he loves. We are incredibly lucky to have a champion in Peter, and we honor him tonight. Now, everything I just said about Peter is true and richly deserved, but I would like to briefly share with you one personal experience I had with him about 12 years ago. I had broken my leg and was having surgery at St. Francis Hospital on a Monday morning, and I was in the recovery room, flat on my back, and I woke up, my eyes opened, and hovering above me was Peter G. Kelly. I closed my eyes and I said, "Lord, it looks like the operation didn't go so well." I tried to live a good life, but somewhere along the line I really screwed up. So, later I learned that Peter was in the hospital visiting his daughter and just happened to be there when I was rolled in. So it's an experience I'll never forget, unfortunately. So please join me in honoring Paul Buddy Buca and Peter G. Kelly. So thank you to all the incredible leaders who are here tonight, and thank you again for your support. And please have a wonderful evening and enjoy our fantastic guests, Norah O'Donnell and CIA Director Bill Burns. And now to continue this fantastic evening, I am pleased to turn things over to Megan Clark-Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and the person who brilliantly and selflessly organized this evening's events. So, Megan.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you all for being here. I do want to recognize a few people are in the room with us. So many aren't important, but we have so many ambassadors and consuls general from around the world, too many to single out each country, but I welcome our visitors who are investing in our mission from around the world and who believe in what we do. I also want to say that we have Major General Fran Yvonne, our Adjutant General for the state of Connecticut for our National Guard, and Captain Kenneth Curtin, who is the commanding officer of our submarine base in Groton, Connecticut. As you know, we are the submarine capital of the world here in the state. It really is a true honor to be with all of you tonight. I am lucky to be the steward of this organization, of the World Affairs Council, but I stand here in the shoes of all those that came before me. While maybe everyone that was just on the stage was a man, I can say that every executive director of our World Affairs Council has been a woman. From the first executive director, known only in our paperwork as Mrs. Robert Hepburn. In fact, her name was Susanna Floyd Hepburn. Yes, she was Catherine's sister-in-law. Our executive director, Betty Knapp, who in the 1950s and 1960s led this organization from her wheelchair, who was a sought-after international speaker who traveled the world speaking about international relations. She hosted a radio show here in Hartford where she interviewed all kinds of world leaders. I think today she would just have a podcast. We went on to have Betsy Hart as our executive director, the legendary Marjorie Anderson, and of course, my incredible predecessor who's here with us tonight, Felicity Harley. If you know anything about nonprofits, what you know is that we oftentimes survive on sheer will and determination. And I have to say that these women were fierce fighters and believers in our work and in the fact that if we engage, if we know more about the world, that this world would be a better place. That's right. I do want to call out the fact that we have two members in the room that have been members since 1970. We have Walter Murphy with us and Henry Link. This is pretty amazing. The other call out is that we've also been responsible for Love Connections. So Jim and Jackie Connor are here, who met at the World Affairs Council in the 1990s. So you may have heard that one of the most impactful things that we have done in our 50 years is our Model United Nations. I want you to hear from 3 of our Model UN alumni. Masay?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Masay. I participated in Model UN back in my junior and senior year of high school during 2016 throughout 2018. As a student of Harvard High, Academy of Law and Government. Model UN helped me gain leadership and communications that I continue to use at college. And I was the first generation to go to school, where I come from, back in Thailand, refugee camp. Issues taking place halfway around the globe impact our life, educations, our work, healthcare, and our communities. CTWAC Model UN helped me learn about the world as we present countries other than our own, and create possible solution global challenges, as well as by participating in Model UN, I was able to receive the World Affairs Council Scholarship to help me continue my path throughout the higher educations. Thank you, Megan. And thank you, the World Council Affairs, for making a difference in my life and for others, young people. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Alan Haw, and I participated in the World Affairs Council of Connecticut's Model UN program while I was at Farmington High School, and I served as president of the conference in 2016. Through the Model UN program, I was able to engage with global issues that remain relevant today, and I learned key lessons at that formative age. I learned the value of articulating interests in a way that others can understand and relate to, about the importance of formulating creative solutions in the face of seemingly intractable problems, and about the increasingly complex and competitive international landscape in which America seeks to assert itself. I've since had the privilege of serving in the White House and now the State Department, working to maintain our nation's leadership in semiconductors and other critical technologies that are key to America's global competitiveness. Looking back, I'm struck by how applicable the lessons I learned as a Model UN participant have been to my life and work. The Connecticut World Affairs Council's mission has always been to bring the world to Connecticut. I'm grateful for the impact that's had on me, and I'm excited to see the impact that will have for years to come. Thank you.
My name is Phil Cocciola. And in 1955, during my senior year at Hall High School in West Hartford, I participated in the Model UN Assembly as a member of a delegation representing Great Britain. We had the opportunity to take the train to New York, meet with officials from the British mission who helped us accurately understand the British position on several issues we were preparing to discuss. I graduated from high school, later went on to major in Spanish and French at the University of Connecticut, and I taught in West Hartford for a few years. I served 31 years in the Army, received a graduate degree in higher education administration, and helped that helped me as a founding administrator at Tunxus Community College in Farmington. Participating in the Model UN Assembly was a great experience, provided an opportunity to further explore my interest in international affairs and global events as a student and later as an Army officer. It provided skills in speech, leadership that I took with me into my years as an educator and later on. I'm very glad to see that the Model UN Assembly program is still going, and just about 70 years after I was in it, it looks like it's going to go on for many more years.
Thank you, Masay and Alan and Phil, and I'm so happy that all of you could join us, showing our 72 years of impact. So what we do best at the World Affairs Council is provide a forum for open discussion, oftentimes historic discussions. It is now my privilege to introduce the highlight of this evening, the highlight of our 100th anniversary celebration, our moderator and guest speaker. Both are extraordinary history-making individuals. Our moderator, Norah O'Donnell, and as my other role is as U.S. Navy Ambassador to the state of Connecticut, and I want to thank Norah publicly for all of the work that she's been doing to highlight the extraordinary work our United States Navy does. Thank you so much, Norah. Norah O'Donnell is the managing editor and anchor of the CBS Evening News, the oldest and most revered news broadcast in America. She is also a contributing correspondent for 60 Minutes. O'Donnell is a multiple Emmy Award-winning journalist with nearly 3 decades of experience covering the biggest stories in the world and conducting impactful news-making interviews. She is currently covering her 7th presidential election and has interviewed every living president of the United States. To note, Norah O'Donnell is the only woman to anchor an evening news program on broadcast television. William J. Burns is the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He's also known as America's secret diplomatic weapon. His distinguished diplomatic career has made him one of our country's most impactful statesmen. From an early posting in Syria, Ambassador Burns has served in senior national security positions, including Assistant Secretary for Near East, Ambassador to Russia and Jordan, and Deputy Secretary of State. After retirement from the State Department, Director Burns was the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He also wrote a best-selling book, The Back Channel. In 2021, he returned to public service again, accepting the president's nomination to serve as CIA director. His unique skill set, which is a combination of competence, confidence, and humility, is the reason why I think our administration relies on him so heavily in Ukraine, in Gaza, and other critical national securities that our world is facing today. Ambassador Burns, thank you for visiting Connecticut, the basketball capital of the nation. I've heard on good authority that your basketball game mirrors your diplomacy. No flashy Paige Beckers moves, no Donovan dunks, just quiet, unselfish play, and I understand you have a pretty deadly 15-foot shot. Ladies and gentlemen, we are privileged to welcome with us tonight Norah O'Donnell and Director William J. Burns.
Well, Megan, thank you very, very much for that warm introduction, and happy 100th anniversary to the World Affairs Council. And Director Burns, what an honor it is to be able to speak with you tonight. I know you've been pretty busy.
No, it's great to be with you, Norah, again, and congratulations to the World Affairs Council on your first 100 years. And thank you all very much, especially for the opportunity to escape Washington, D.C., even if it's only for a few hours. My basketball skills were just exaggerated a lot. My vertical leap is now in single digits. So anyways, it's wonderful to be in the basketball capital of the world.
Megan mentioned your incredible book. It is definitely worth a read, and many incredible stories through your 40 years as a diplomat. How would you describe the state of the world right now?
Oh, I think the state of the world right now is full of challenges. It's as unsettled as I think as I've seen it in 40 years in public service, both as a diplomat and now as an intelligence officer, with lots of challenges for us as an intelligence service too. Long-term challenges like competition with the People's Republic of China, a revolution in technology, which is changing the way we live, work, fight, and compete, and which is right at the core of our ability to succeed as an intelligence agency. And then the immediate challenges, the war in Ukraine, now in its third year, and the aggression of Vladimir Putin, which is a huge challenge, I think, on the international landscape. And then the crisis in the Middle East, where I've spent a lot of my career as a diplomat, which is also an incredibly difficult set of challenges for the United States.
So he just set up, there's a lot to talk about tonight. Let's start with the news. Israel's strike last night on Iran, it was limited in scope. The response from Iranians has been muted, I guess you could say today. Has Israel and Iran stepped back from the brink for now?
Well, just to take a step back, I mean, all of us remember last Saturday night, Iran launched a massive drone and missile strike against Israel, some 330 drones and missiles. And quite remarkably, which is a testament to good air defense and good intelligence, Israel, supported by the United States and other friends and partners, defeated that attack. Only about, 99% of those missiles and drones did not impact in Israel, and the few that did very little damage. Since then, the president has made very clear that the United States is not going to take part or support any offensive action, and we have not done that. The president also made clear that our overriding priority is to de-escalate the situation right now, because as I said before, the Middle East is a part of the world which has no shortage of insecurities and tensions right now. And so given that overriding priority in de-escalation, that kind of overrides any temptation that I might have right now to comment on what happened last night. A lot of times when you're trying to de-escalate a situation, I found over many years in public service, the less said, the better. And so I'm not going to go any further on what happened last night.
I appreciate that. Let's talk about what is the end game, though, because you have spent so much time in the region since October 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel. Is the Biden administration pushing for a diplomatic deal? This is the long one. We'll talk about the hostage in a minute. But what is the Biden administration pushing for in a diplomatic deal? What would that mean in terms of recognition of Israel by Saudi Arabia? What does that deal look like?
Well, I think there, amidst all the challenges on the landscape in the Middle East now, there are some opportunities too. There's the possibility of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But a lot of this hinges right now on the future of the Palestinian issue too, because, as difficult as it is to imagine a two-state solution for Palestinians and Israelis, the complexities of negotiating statehood for Palestinians, as difficult as all that is, in all the years I've spent in the Middle East, it's hard for me to imagine a stable solution, one that serves the interests not only of Palestinians, but also the long-term interests of Israelis, that does not involve a negotiated solution that results in a Palestinian state. That's much easier said than it is than done. But I think that's the longer-term challenge, to answer your question before us. There are opportunities for further normalization, as I said, between Israel and the Arab world. But first, the conflict in Gaza has to end, and that's a horrifying humanitarian situation right now for innocent civilians in Gaza. It's a horrifying situation for those hostages held by Hamas, whose brutal attack on the 7th of October against Israelis is what sparked all this in the first place. So, as you mentioned, Norah, I've been very wrapped up since October in negotiations to try to produce a ceasefire and the release of hostages, working with my Qatari, Israeli, and Egyptian counterparts, all really capable professionals. At the end of last year, we helped produce one short-term ceasefire, the release of 100 hostages, mostly women and children at that time. And we've been working really hard since then to try to renew that process, but it's pushing a very big rock up a very steep hill. A couple of weeks ago in Cairo, we made a proposal which was pretty far-reaching to try to produce a 6-week ceasefire in exchange for the release of 40 of the hostages who are held now, the release of a number of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel in exchange, and the massive influx of humanitarian assistance to Gazans who so desperately need it. This stretched the boundaries of Israel's position on a lot of those issues. Hamas, deeply unfortunately, responded negatively to that proposal, and so in a way it's that negative position right now that, at least for the moment, is standing in the way of further progress there. But
Hamas is standing in the way.
I think the position that Hamas has taken in response to those most recent proposal is a pretty significant obstacle right now. So I don't know whether we're going to succeed in renewing this process and producing a 6-week ceasefire as the first step toward a longer-term ceasefire. What I do know, I think, are 2 or 3 things. First, the alternatives to that are all worse. They're worse for innocent civilians in Gaza. They're worse for hostages and their families. And I think they're worse for all of us. Second, I think the region desperately needs that kind of a ceasefire. The last time, at the end of last year, when a ceasefire existed, all the various Iranian proxy groups in the region, Hezbollah, the Shia militia groups in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, all observed that. So I think it would have a calming influence on the rest of the region as well. And the other thing that I know is that it's not going to be for lack of trying, at least on our part, to try to produce that kind of ceasefire.
You mentioned the success that you've had, at least with the first 100 hostages, based on many of the negotiations that you have been in. But there are still about 130 hostages unaccounted for. How many of those 130 hostages still in Gaza, taken on October 7th, does Israel and the U.S. believe are still alive?
Well, I mean, Norah, as you can imagine, I don't want to go into the numbers on that. I think it's fair to say that, a number of hostages have died either on October 7th or since then. But we're going to work very hard, not just to achieve that next tranche of hostage releases, but to ensure that all of those hostages are released, because the conditions in which they're being held are really inhuman. And at the same time, we want to try to do everything we can to relieve the suffering of so many innocent civilians in Gaza.
I ask that question because I think it's in part at the heart of why Hamas has not agreed to this latest deal, or does Hamas keep moving the goalposts?
Well, I think, it's our judgment that Hamas is capable of, releasing a number of hostages right now, and, we feel a great sense of urgency about achieving that.
Mm-hmm. What's happening in the Israel-Hamas war is creating a U.S. national security threat. Not only domestic unrest, anti-Semitism, protests at colleges and universities. How serious is the threat to the U.S. homeland?
Well, I think you have a terrorist threat, and the Gaza crisis, in many ways, I think, magnifies that kind of threat in the sense that you get individuals who are radicalized and terrorist groups who have already been threatening the United States, who feel even greater motivation to try to do that. It's a very large part of the job of CIA is to help keep Americans safe, to produce the very best intelligence that we can about whether it's groups or individuals who might threaten Americans overseas and certainly in the homeland. And so that's something we stay very sharply focused on. It was only about 1.5 years ago that the United States took a successful strike against Ayman al-Zawahiri in a safe house, at least what al-Qaeda thought was a safe house in the middle of downtown Kabul, with no other collateral damage, nobody else hurt too. And that was a reflection of the determination of the agency that I'm so proud to lead, and the US government more broadly, to try to ensure, again, that Americans are safe against terrorist threats, even if in that case it took us 20 years to accomplish that.
The intelligence community has described the terror threat stemming from October 7th as generational. Where are you seeing ideologies strengthen or shift?
Well, I think you look at a group like ISIS, which reared its head in a very dangerous and threatening way in Iraq and Syria a decade ago, where through concerted effort by the United States and a lot of coalition partners, they've been pushed back there, but you see them reemerge and responsible for a variety of attacks recently, including in Moscow about 5 or 6 weeks ago as well, in an instance where the United States, through what's called a duty to warn, actually provided quite accurate intelligence to the Russians, about what we thought was going to happen, which resulted in the deaths of, lots of Russian civilians as well. So I would never underestimate the reach of groups like that.
Let's talk about the war in Ukraine. President Zelensky says his military has run out of missiles to defend itself from Russian airstrikes. How dire is the situation there?
Well, I think the situation is extremely serious right now. I've been to Ukraine 10 times during the course of the war in my capacity. Just to show you that President Zelensky, who was trained as a professional comedian, even in the most dire of circumstances, hasn't lost his sense of humor. The last time I went, he told me I was entitled to a free upgrade on the train from Poland to Kyiv.
Which takes how long?
On my 10th visit. It takes about 10 hours.
Yeah.
But, I'm deeply committed, and I know the President and the United States are deeply committed to supporting Ukraine against the brutal aggression of Vladimir Putin. But this is a tough moment on the battlefield. The Ukrainians are not running out of courage and tenacity. They're running out of ammunition, and I think we're running out of time to help them. That's why what the Congress, the House of Representatives, is debating right now is so important, debating whether or not to approve further supplemental military assistance for Ukraine. To answer your question, Norah, I think with that supplemental assistance, Ukraine can hold its own on the battlefield through 2024 and continue to inflict damage on Russia, both with deeper strikes in Crimea and also against Russia's Black Sea Fleet, where the Ukrainians have sunk 16 ships just over the last 6 months. So the Ukrainians are entirely capable of more than holding their own. But without that supplemental assistance, as they run out of ammunition, I think the situation could get a lot more dire. And there is a real risk that Ukrainians could lose on the battlefield in 2024, or at least put Putin in a position where he could essentially dictate the terms of a political settlement as well. When I was on the last visit to Ukraine, it was just 2 or 3 days after the Ukrainians lost the Battle of Avdiivka, which is a relatively small city in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk. And I remember talking to one of the Ukrainian commanders who had fought in that battle, and he said that we fought as long and as hard as we could, but we ran out of ammunition and the Russians just kept coming. What I worry about is we're going to see more and more Avdiivkas in the year ahead unless we provide that assistance which is less than 4% of the overall U.S. defense budget, assistance which in many ways helps create jobs in the U.S. defense industry, but assistance that is sorely needed by the Ukrainians today as a way not only of helping them defeat Putin's aggression, but sending a really important signal elsewhere in the world, not least in the Indo-Pacific to Xi Jinping's China as well, because I think President Xi was sobered by what he saw of Putin's experience in Ukraine, especially in the first year of the war. I think President Xi, like Putin, assumed that this was going to be a cakewalk, that the Ukrainians were a weak and divided country, as Putin put it, not a real country. Well, President Zelensky and Ukrainians have demonstrated that real countries fight back, and that's what they did. And I think that had with our support, and I think that's had a sobering effect on the way in which President Xi looks at his ambitions and in the Indo-Pacific. The surest way to stoke his ambitions, I think, would be for us to be seen to be walking away from Ukraine right now.
Why is President Xi of China watching so closely what's happening in Ukraine? What's he looking to see?
Well, I think he's looking to see, I think he assumed the performance of the Russian military, which Putin had invested a lot in, over the last 20 years. would easily overwhelm what is objectively a much smaller Ukrainian military. And I think one of the lessons he learned is not to assume that. When people are determined to defend themselves, they'll be very, imaginative and creative, as well as, extremely tenacious as well. I think it came as a strategic surprise in many ways to President Xi when he saw the United States and our European allies stand up in support of Ukraine in as decisive a way as we did, as the coalition that President Biden put together has been able to do, that we were willing to work with our allies and partners to inflict economic costs on Russia and absorb some of those costs ourselves. And I think, all of those are lessons that I think President Xi has watched very carefully as well. And so I think, as we think about what's at stake in Ukraine, it's important to understand that this is not only about Ukrainians. As important as that is, it's not only about European security, it's about what's at stake for the United States and our allies and partners across the Indo-Pacific as well.
This is so interesting. So on that point, it is the CIA's own assessment that China's president has ordered its army, the PLA, to take back the island of Taiwan by force by 2027. Has that changed based on what's happening in Ukraine?
Well, I think, what we've said and what a number of senior U.S. military officers have said is that, we believe that President Xi instructed his military, the People's Liberation Army, to be ready by 2027 to accomplish an all-out invasion of Taiwan. That's a readiness target. That doesn't mean that he's decided to invade Taiwan in 2027 or 2028 or 2026. And that's why I think the kind of lessons that China absorbs from experiences in Ukraine matter so much, because I think that can have, as I said before, a sobering effect on their calculus about ambitions that I would never underestimate about President Xi or the current Chinese leadership to control Taiwan. But I think what we do in Ukraine, what we do on other issues, does have an impact on that calculus.
We are going to talk more about China, but I didn't want to finish on Ukraine and Russia without talking about Vladimir Putin. You have a long history with him.
Most of my gray hair came from dealing with President Putin.
Well, I did a little research. You've called him cocky, cranky, aggrieved, and insecure. Just how dangerous is Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think he's demonstrated, in the war in Ukraine, his unprovoked aggression there over more than 2 years now, how dangerous his ambitions can be. I mean, as I've watched Vladimir Putin over the years, I mean, he always seems to me to be a kind of combustible combination, as you were saying, Norah, of grievance and ambition and insecurity all wrapped up together. The longer he's been in power, now over more than 2 decades, the more he's tightened his grip on Russia, the smaller his circle of advisors has become, and it is a very insular circle today. There were probably only 3 or 4 other senior Russian officials who were privy to his plan to invade Ukraine up until, a week or 2 before the war.
How many of them are still alive?
Oh, those guys are still around, I think. But I mean, part of it is that their own views in that very small circle are in many ways as hard or harder than Putin's, or at least they've learned that it's not career enhancing to challenge his judgments, over the course of their tenures. So as you've seen, that trend line over the years, you've also seen Putin's sense of destiny and his appetite for risk also increase. And nowhere has that been clearer than in Ukraine, because ever since I've watched Putin, he's had a brutal fixation on controlling Ukraine and controlling its choices. He cannot imagine Russia as a great power or him as a great Russian leader without controlling Ukraine. And that's what I think, as much as anything else, impelled him to invade Ukraine, at the beginning of 2022. I think he had come to the conviction that his window strategically was closing to accomplish control and subordination of Ukraine. And tactically, he saw a landscape that favored that. As I said before, I think he believed Ukraine was a weak and divided country. He thought Europeans were distracted and risk-averse. Who knows what he thought about the United States? He thought he had modernized the Russian military to the point that Ukraine would be no competition. He thought he had kind of sanctions-proofed the Russian economy. He made a lot of very bad calculations. And especially in the first year of the war, Russia suffered some significant setbacks, again, thanks to the bravery and determination of Ukrainians with our support.
Let's talk about artificial intelligence. What's your biggest concern when it comes to our foreign adversaries and AI?
Oh, I think it's that, they'll be able to master all the technologies associated with artificial intelligence and machine learning, not only faster than the United States and our allies can, but employ them in ways that, whether it's in military terms or technological terms, enable them to compete better than we can. I don't think there's anything inevitable about that. I think the United States, and I don't mean this as a statement of American arrogance, but I think we're entirely capable of competing very effectively in those spheres, as well as in other really challenging spheres, semiconductors, quantum computing as well. I think we're playing a very strong hand. If we have a focus, if we tap into what's best in terms of the innovativeness in American industry, if government agencies like CIA build better partnerships with the private sector, fully 1/3 of our officers work full-time, digital, cyber, science, and technological issues. So we have a lot of in-house talent. But the truth is, we're not going to be able to compete effectively with the People's Republic of China in AI or machine learning unless we're tapping into the innovation, the creativity, the imagination, the drive of the private sector as well. So we work very hard. We created for the first time a chief technology officer position at CIA. We created a new mission center, which is one of the organizational building blocks, the dozen or so building blocks at the agency, focused on technology and building better partnerships with the private sector. So I'm confident in our ability to compete. I'm not complacent about it, though, and we just have to continue to drive and demonstrate initiative.
On the topic of technology, cyber attacks, yesterday the FBI director said China is preparing to attack U.S. infrastructure, and they are waiting for the right moment to, quote, deal a devastating blow. What kind of infrastructure are the Chinese targeting, and is the U.S. prepared?
We're working hard to ensure that we're prepared. As my colleague Chris Wray, the FBI director, said, though, we see lots of evidence of the Chinese working quite methodically to develop access to critical infrastructure, including critical civilian infrastructure in this country. And we take that very, very seriously, not just from our point of view as an external intelligence service, collecting intelligence and information about Chinese plans and actions, but also working with our domestic partners like FBI to make sure we're doing everything we can to help harden that critical infrastructure against efforts to disrupt and gain access.
How much of China's malware has the U.S. uncovered or mitigated?
Well, I think this is more an issue for the FBI or Homeland Security, too. As they look at, the domestic challenge there, too. But I think we're making fair progress.
Let me ask it this way. What's China up to?
Well, I think it's up to wanting, on that issue anyway, to enhance its access, its ability to disrupt if it chose to do that as part of a broader long-term strategy. If you ask what's China up to in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific, I think it's the long-term ambition is to be the predominant player in that part of the world, which means dislodging the United States, which for years and years has worked with our allies and partners to try to ensure everything from space for democracies to flourish, for open economic systems to flourish as well. The one thing I think that one of the biggest assets the United States has, and I've seen this both as a diplomat and now in the job I'm proud to hold today, directing the Central Intelligence Agency, is we have networks of allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific and Europe and around the world. By contrast, China and Russia, despite the closeness of their ties today, are relatively lonely powers. So if we invest, if we don't take for granted, those allies and partners And if we get our act together at home and, renew our own domestic political and economic system, I think we can compete quite effectively with China, certainly with Russia, and we ought to approach that competition with confidence. I mean, at least that's the attitude that we have at CIA.
One of the big concerns you've heard discussed sort of with domestic politics is the crisis at the border. Let's talk about fentanyl, because the Select Committee on China in Congress this week released a new report where they found that China is directly subsidizing the manufacturing and export of fentanyl precursor materials. So that was new to me, because certainly in my reporting, we knew that China was sending these precursor materials to Mexico. They're making the fentanyl, coming across the border, and now the #1 killer of young people in America. But what this report did, which I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, said that China itself is directly subsidizing many of these companies that are doing it. So is this the state-sponsored poisoning of America?
Well, what it is, I think, clearly is that the People's Republic of China, its leadership, is not enforcing its own laws. I mean, laws that in some ways would, restrict people from mislabeling exports to the United States, as you said, pill pressing equipment and chemical precursors that are essential to the Mexican cartels and Sinaloa and Jalisco, which produce so much of the fentanyl, which is poisoning a generation of Americans, and last year caused the deaths of more than 100,000 Americans as well. So as the president emphasized to President Xi when they met face-to-face in California last November, this is a critical issue for us. And it's not just the United States singing solo on this. The Mexican leadership, European leaderships have also pressed the Chinese leadership to do more. There are some signs, after the president's meeting that the Chinese are taking this a little more seriously. But, this is something we have to press with real urgency, even as, again, as an external intelligence service, we try to help collect intelligence on what those cartels are doing, so that we can enable both our Mexican security partners, but also our domestic U.S. law enforcement partners and the DEA and other U.S. agencies to combat, what is a serious and growing threat. One of the issues you may have seen that's being debated in Congress right now is whether to reauthorize something called Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And essentially what this does is enable the United States intelligence community, law enforcement community, to collect on foreigners operating overseas, so outside the United States, but who just happen to use U.S. telecommunications platforms. And this is very strictly regulated. It's something we take very seriously to protect U.S. person information, which is sometimes collected in this process. There's a number of reforms that are in this legislation that the Congress is considering right now, but I mention it only because its reauthorization, its passage, I think is a crucial tool to fight fentanyl, because something like 70% of all the successful disruptions of fentanyl traffic moving into the United States that we've been a part of have come directly from intelligence derived from 702.
And as the director was just talking about, Congress has resisted the reauthorization of Section 702. You are also pushing for, or the Biden administration and intelligence community is pushing for the expansion to include counter-narcotics, correct?
That's right, and it's precisely because of the fentanyl challenge. I mean, this has been used, 702 has been a really valuable tool for us at CIA in helping to keep Americans safe from terrorist threats as well. It's also extremely useful in our efforts to recruit, whether it's Russians or Chinese or others too, because it enables us, to help identify everything from their patterns of life as you're trying to, come in contact with people overseas as well. So it's an incredibly important tool, but its expansion to focus on the counter-narcotics challenge is really important, I think, to the safety and security of Americans.
Could you give me like a real-world example of how that would work without
Sure.
revealing anything that would
Yeah,
compromise?
I mean,
like how would that help
Sure. No, I'd be glad to. I mean, there was one instance over the course of the past year where we came across information about a shipment of chemical precursors for fentanyl that was going to come through the United States. And, you know, we didn't have very much notice. It was less than 48 hours notice, but we were able to pass that intelligence to our domestic partners, the FBI and others, in a way that enabled them to confiscate that shipment and prevent what could have been, I think, the creation of, you know, enormous amount of fentanyl that could have poisoned an enormous number of Americans too. So that's one example. There are other examples where not only have we confiscated pill pressing equipment, but, you know, we've also enabled our Mexican partners to make arrests of very serious cartel leaders in Sinaloa, for example, who were responsible for the production and distribution of a lot of that fentanyl too. So it's been a really valuable tool, but you know, you have to take advantage of it quickly. That's part of the challenge too, because there's an argument by some in Congress, and I can understand the rationale for it, to require warrants each time you want to use this.
Because some of it could be domestic?
Yeah, but the problem with that is it's just the time it would take, because when you come across information like this, you've got to move very quickly as well. Again, in the interests of keeping Americans safe.
Mm-hmm. I don't have to remind you or anybody here, it is an election year. The intelligence community just released a memo warning that China, Iran, and Russia are currently trying to interfere in US elections. How concerned are you? What are they doing?
Quite concerned. I mean, I think the Chinese and you know, the FBI also focuses on this very intently, have been relatively cautious in terms of interfering directly in our election, although they're not at all particularly cautious in monitoring their citizens abroad and oftentimes trying to intimidate them as well. Russians far less cautious. They've demonstrated in prior elections their, you know, intent and capability to, you know, in a sense, amplify a lot of the dysfunctions in our own system, to use them in many respects to undermine our democratic system. The Iranians, you know, we've seen evidence of them attempting to do this as well over the years. So again, our focus at CIA is outside our borders, trying to collect intelligence on what those players and others, you know, may be planning to do to interfere in our elections or to undermine our democratic system. And then we work very closely with the FBI and Department of Homeland Security and others to try to counter that as best we can.
Mm-hmm. And many of the threats are outlined in documents that are open source. Anybody here can read about them in the annual threat assessment and more.
It's true.
Have you seen foreign actors indicate a preference for either candidate?
CIA is a resolutely apolitical institution. So.
Yes. Well, you don't have to say who. I'm not.
Yeah, no. I mean, we see people trying to put their thumb on the scale sometimes. But again, oftentimes what the Russians do, for example, is to take dysfunctions, polarization, that, to be fair, if that's the right word, we can create in abundance sometimes in our own society, and then take advantage of that as well, and exploit it and magnify it and make it even more dangerous than, you know, that it already is. And so we see lots of evidence of that.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that's outlined in, I believe it's the annual threat assessment that I was reading today, talks about how much, for instance, there are just fake websites that purport to be news websites, and they are Russian propaganda, for instance.
That's true too, or, you know, huge numbers of bots and others that are meant to try to amplify, you know, what is oftentimes a very polarized debate in our society.
And does the CIA track how much of that Russian propaganda then ends up in the rhetoric of US lawmakers?
Well, it's not, I mean, what we focus on is what the Russians are trying to do from the outside in. And so we focus on groups like Russia's, there's a group called the Social Design Agency, which is very closely connected to the Kremlin, that's been responsible for some hacking efforts in the United States and, you know, a lot of similar kinds of activity too. So it really falls to our domestic partners to focus on those kind of issues.
I know that many of you wrote questions for the director, so I'm going to pose some of them to you. One question, do you believe the events of October 7th and Israel's response and recent aggressions against Iran, Syria, and Lebanon could lead the United States into a world war?
You know, there's always a risk of expanding conflict in the Middle East. I've spent, most of the last 40 years in public service working in and on the Middle East, so I never underestimate the risk. I think we're working really hard right now, as I was saying before, Norah, to try to de-escalate the situation, and that's what we're going to continue to try to do. And I think the challenge since October 7th is, for Israelis, when I travel back and forth right now, a lot of times, for us, it may seem like 6 months ago. For many Israelis, October 7th is yesterday. And so the feeling of insecurity that came from that brutal attack by Hamas is still very real. But, I look at the suffering of innocent civilians in Gaza, and I also see something that's very real and that calls out for desperate attention, which is why, as I was saying before, we work so hard on the ceasefire hostage negotiations as well, because otherwise the risk is just going to grow of an expansion of this conflict too. We've seen just over the last couple of weeks, the indicators of that, the possibilities of that, and the exchanges between Iran and Israel as well. So that's what lends real urgency to trying to do everything we can to help bring this conflict to an end.
When do you think it'll happen?
I hope soon. I hope soon for the sake of, lots of civilians, for the sake of hostages, for the sake of stability in the region. I mean, I understand the importance.
In the world, yeah.
And the world. And I understand the importance that, Israel attaches to ensuring that Hamas can never again do what it did on October 7th, that it can't govern Gaza again, that it's defeated decisively. I understand that. But the challenge is, when that comes at the expense of lots of innocent civilians in Gaza, it just adds urgency to trying to resolve this conflict.
Mm-hmm. Another question by Bill. Reportedly, recruiting agents in Russia has become easier. How does that impact?
I wouldn't say it's easier. It's really.
Yeah, is that true? I guess I would add, is that true?
It's really hard work. I think it's possible, and I'll be careful in what I say, but I think there's a fair amount of disaffection in Russia today with, Putin's decision to go to war in Ukraine. And that's created opportunities for us as an intelligence service. And, as we've said publicly before, we're open for business. We're a human intelligence service. And so, we focus very much on trying to expand the number of Russians that we work with. We even have done something over the last year, which is a little bit novel anyway, doing recruiting videos on the Telegram channel that about 40% of the Russian population watches regularly. And that's actually been very productive without going into a lot of details. It has, if nothing else, thoroughly pissed off my Russian counterparts, so we try to be inventive.
We'll wrap it up with this because we're just about done, but I did mention your memoir, and you open it up saying, I remember clearly the moment, and you were talking about the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991, and you said, I remember clearly the moment when I saw American diplomacy and power at its peak, and so much has changed since that. What do you hope to see in terms of a renewal?
Yeah, I think that was a moment, so this is more than 30 years ago, when I was working for Secretary of State Baker, about whom we were just discussing, a really wonderful diplomat. But it was a moment at which American power in the world was at its peak. What's changed over the last 30 years, in many ways inevitably, is that we're no longer today the only big kid on the geopolitical block. As I said before, I'd still rather play our hand than China's, or certainly Russia's, or anyone else's. But that puts a premium on diplomacy, as I mentioned before, on working with allies and partners. The same is true in intelligence, too. One of the reasons I travel as much as I do around the world, and I'm about to leave on my 66th overseas trip, in the 3 years I've been director, is because you want to build those kind of relationships with intelligence services, too. That's our, great strength in many respects too. And that's what makes me, for all of our challenges at home, that's what makes me optimistic about the United States and, what's possible, I think, in the world, the good that we can do as well. I mean, one of your colleagues was mentioning earlier the famous Winston Churchill quote about how, the thing he always admired about Americans is that they always do the right thing in the end. They just like to exhaust all the alternatives first. What I've found in many years working overseas as a diplomat, now as an intelligence officer, is what lots of people admire about the United States is that, it's not that we're perfect. We have lots of problems and lots of flaws, and we create some of them for ourselves. But at our best, we're pretty good at least trying to fix those problems and address them. And that, again, at our best is, what makes our democratic system attractive, too. And so I think as long as we stay focused not just on admiring our problems, but actually doing something about them, then I'm confident about not just what the U.S. intelligence community can accomplish, but what all of us can accomplish as Americans.
Well said.